Yeah, there was someone in it.
Fourth speaker is Samuel.
This is in practice.
You know.
I'm done with that now.
Oh my god.
I think you're just that tired. Alright. 15 judges. Are you ready? Alright, opponents? See? Lawson. No, Lawson. Alright. Because sometimes you have to pick the gun up to put the gun down, Lofton and I affirm resolve. You and peacekeepers have the power to engage in offensive operations. Contention 1, protecting civilians. James Arbuckle, the Canadian International Peacekeeping Center, explains, in the Cold War era of traditional peacekeeping, force was no part of missions except in the case of a direct threat to the life of a peacekeeper. Unfortunately, this approach significantly harms peacekeeping efforts to protect civilians. Brett Schaefer of the Heritage Foundation explains, uncertainty over rules of engagement and peacekeeping operations to protect civilians contributed to tragic decisions to stand down in the face of atrocities such as in Rwanda in 1994 and Srebrenica in 1995, where over 800,000 civilians were slaughtered. In light of consistent failure to protect civilians, UN mandates expanded peacekeeping operations to include offensive force to protect civilians, leading to drastic improvements. Rose Brooks of Georgetown University finds their civilian protective mandates for UN peacekeeping forces has helped protect civilians in the Côte d'Ivoire, Yemen, Libya, and Mali with impressive success. Holistically, Coffee Prepper of Ohio Northern University finds robust peacekeeping decreases civilian killings by about 31% per year compared to traditional peacekeeping. Not only have offensive operations better protected civilians, but peacekeepers' power deters attacks. Samantha Powers, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, stated, warlords and militants take notice of peacekeepers' willingness to stand up or to stand by. The failure to protect civilians in one mission can undermine the legitimacy of all others. Contention 2, Ukraine. In Ukraine, ethnic separatists backed by Russia are locked in a violent struggle with the government. The only way to bring peace is to deploy peacekeepers with offensive capabilities. As Professor Daniel Dressner of Tufts University wrote in 2014, UN peacekeepers would end the violence in eastern Ukraine and provide humanitarian corridors for residents to escape the violence. Better yet, it would prevent a full-fledged Russian attack. Dressner explains that Russia's ability to use military force to wage war and sponsor separatist violence would be severely restricted. To effectively prevent further bloodshed, peacekeepers would need offensive powers for 2 reasons. First, they would need to attack militant forces who engage in human rights violations, and second, they would need to use drones to conduct offensive surveillance. A recent UN report found that so long as weapons and soldiers continue to cross into Ukraine, the violence will continue. Fortunately, The Guardian reports that with enough drones, the forces will be able to stop the infiltration of men and material from Russia, ending the conflict. The impact of peace in Ukraine is dramatic. The UN reports in the past 10 months there have been almost 5,000 people killed, 10,000 wounded, and over 1 million people displaced. Worse yet, continued conflict could escalate to Russia, to a Russian invasion, and a NATO-Russia nuclear war. Forbes magazine observed that war-fighting doctrine and capabilities exist on both sides and could lead to a nuclear use and a confrontation over Ukraine. Contention 3, domestic spending. War-torn nations have been locked in a cycle of poverty and conflict, having to devote resources to combat security threats and send it to further development projects. Colin Hendricks of the University of Denver finds conflict means increased military spending, crowding out other social expenditures. Offensive operations end this cycle by alleviating the military burden from the host nation. Hyun-Ma Yo of the University of Aberdeen finds the intervention of peacekeeping efforts decrease defense expenditures. This is beneficial according to Robert Stein of Rice University because decreased military expenditures free money for other domestic needs such as health and education. The result is breaking the cycle of poverty and war. Schengen Fan of the International Food Policy Research Institute empirically finds that reductions on defense to increase spending on health and education leads to significant economic growth, reducing poverty and fighting the root causes of violence. Put simply, offensive operations by peacekeepers help war-torn nations get on their feet and stay there for the long haul. Vote for peace, vote for the people, vote pro.
We'll be taking some brief comment, please. Someone here got
No.
Are all 15 judges ready? All right.
Sure.
Sam and I negate resolve, UN peacekeepers have the power to engage in offensive operations. Contention 1, offense creates a hostile environment for peace. In order to engage in offensive operations, the UN inherently has to go in on the side of one group. James Sloan of the University of Glasgow explains that UN offense would necessarily have to be on behalf of the government, because if not, it would lose the government's goodwill and its continued operation in the state would be extremely difficult. As a result, Curtis Ragavan explains in the Washington Post, the UN could be seen as propping up a corrupt government and aiding an undisciplined military that has a history of human rights abuses. There are two impacts. First, Ragavan explains, this could affect the UN's ability to negotiate peace deals with the militias and risks deepening conflicts because the rebels have no faith that the UN will act as a neutral arbiter. Second, it undermines the operation of civilian protection, peacekeepers, and peace building. Sloan furthers, offensive force will undoubtedly lead to the routine targeting of UN forces, even where the particular peacekeeping mission at the particular time is not engaging in enforcement functions. Adam Roberts of Oxford explains how offensive force jeopardizes the consent of the parties to the continued presence of standard peacekeeping. As a result, using offense in the short term precludes prospects for peace in the long term, because according to Columbia's Paige Fortna, the presence of traditional peacekeeping reduces the recidivism of conflict by 99%. Intention 2 is offense intensifies conflict. Major Robert Allen writes, the UN system is inherently dysfunctional in regards to mobilizing and controlling the complex military operations required in offensive environments. Absent intervention by an outside non-UN power, they have proven militarily unworkable. This is true due to 4 systemic flaws with offense. First, a lack of funds and equipment. Sloan explains, constant pressures on resources are likely to lead to peacekeeping missions with personnel and resources which are insufficient to accomplish their more forceful mandates. Second, a lack of troops. Sloan explains, the imposition of a forceful mandate may actually lead to states being less willing to contribute troops for fear of increased casualties. Third, a lack of intelligence. Hugh Smith of the Australian Defence Studies Centre finds peacekeepers lack access to sufficient info before they are deployed, making an effective attack near impossible. Fourth, a lack of a unified command structure and communication. Allen explains how the divergent forces with different customs and chains of command make the coordination essential to fulfill their offensive missions near impossible. As a result, NYU Simon Chesterman finds, every single instance which the UN has used military force has ended in utter failure. Indeed, the probability that offensive forces increase violence are greater than the probability that they decrease it for 3 reasons. First, Pietro Van Holder of the Peace and Life Institute finds that offensive forces may be seen as a kind of occupation force. As a consequence, it could become a push factor for some to join armed groups. This could be exacerbated because, according to a Reuters article from yesterday, the newly announced offensive against the FDLR in the Congo could lead to the displacement and antagonism of tens of thousands of civilians, matching the million displaced in the prior offensive and fueling thousands of recruits for rebel groups. Second, Reed Wood of Arizona State explains that directly confronting attackers doesn't eliminate violence. It just changes its nature from soldier-on-soldier violence to soldier-on-civilian violence, as the rebel force feels that they can no longer succeed confronting the UN head-on. Third, by extending the conflict. Sankey Kim of the University of Iowa explains, government-biased interveners tend to encourage both groups to continue fighting and weaken their motives to cooperate with each other to make an agreement, because the backside believe that they can get more benefit by waiting for the ultimate defeat of their enemy. The African Policy Group confirms this, noting how the Congolese army and government walked away from promising negotiations in the Congo once offensive force was announced, believing that they could achieve better terms through the barrel of the gun. University of Utah's Jordan Roberts confirms this, writing that the presence of offensive force increases the probability of civil war reoccurrence for a given year by 680%, while the presence of defensive support decreases the probability of civil war reoccurrence for a given year by 93%. The confluence of these 3 forces empirically increases violence. According to an analysis of UN operations by Coffee Nasia Pepra of Ohio Northern University, quote, when the mandate permits UN forces to use force beyond that of self-defense, the count of intentional civilian killings increases by roughly 1,700 per conflict per year. Break the cycle of violence, vote negative.
Is everyone ready? So at the very bottom of your case, you talk about you cite the Pepper analysis, right? So you say that intentional attacks on civilians go up. So what does Pepper actually conclude?
Pepper concludes that offense is a bad idea for peacekeepers. In fact, you discussed robust peacekeeping yesterday, Pepper. Does Pepper define robustly as distinct from that in which the mandate permits UN forces to use force beyond that of self-defense?
Robust peacekeeping is using whatever force necessary to defend the mandate, including offensive
You
force.
misunderstand. There are limitations on robust peacekeeping.
What are those?
Robust peacekeeping says you are allowed to use force to protect civilians, but you are not allowed to go on the offensive and actually defeat them. Here's the reason. According to the definition of offense by the U.S. military, the definition of offense, you have to actually fire the first shot to defeat and destroy the opposing group. What robust peacekeeping does is use force to protect civilians, but it doesn't seek to actually go out and defeat the group. Robust peacekeeping does not meet the definition of offense. But can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Who's on the Security Council?
A bunch of different countries.
The big five. The big five get the veto power over everyone else.
Sure. Okay.
Why that?
Oh, like Russia, China,
That's all I know.
US.
Russia's on it. They get a veto power over any UN action, right?
Actually, that's not true. In this specific example of the UN, because Russia had actually intervened in the Crimea and actually lost the right to veto because it has an interest in
Lost the
it.
right. No, that is not how the UN Security Council works. You do not cede the right to veto if you have an interest. Big powers
Actually, that's-
always have an interest. Russia is
Sure.
on the Security Council and they get a veto. What's the probability that the UN peacekeepers are going to get in with Russia having that veto on the Security Council?
A lot, because both sides of the conflict, both the
Secessionists?
there, that's the word, and the Ukrainian government both have already called for peacekeeping operations.
But they haven't come through, right? How long has the Ukrainian conflict been around?
Like a year and a half.
And how long has the peacekeepers been there?
Well, we're saying that we need peacekeepers right now. So
What's the
they're not-
probability that they're ever going to get in at the point where they've been calling for this and they haven't arrived because Russia, who doesn't want the peacekeepers there, has a veto on the Security Council?
Okay, why does probability matter? We're only talking about whether they should or not.
Right. Whether the United Nations have the power to engage in offensive operations. If the one example that you're giving me of where it's successful, if you vote pro, they don't go into the Ukraine. You just generally give them the power. They're not going to Ukraine. They're probably going to be doing things like
Here's the
Somalia,
problem,
Congo, those examples.
Here's the problem though. We're not talking about whether they're going to or not. We're talking about whether they should go in or not.
But
We
wait,
show you that they should
wait, no.
because they could solve the
voting
conflict.
pro gives the United Nations peacekeepers the power to engage in offensive operations. It does not give the affirmative the ability to fiat every single conflict that they want to go into and decide, pick and choose at conflicts around the world. You don't get to say, I want Tibet, I want Ukraine. You don't get to choose that. The United Nations does. All voting pro does is give the choice to the United Nations to use offensive force. It does not allow them to pick and choose which conflicts to go in.
I would say it does because it's only talking about should. Like even if the UN doesn't want to go in, they should go in.
That means voting pro, giving them the power to go in, does not mean the peacekeepers going to
We're not giving them, voting pro isn't giving them the power. It's saying that they
Yes.
should give them the power.
Alright, is everybody ready? Yeah. Alright, cool. So before getting into the specifics of my opponent's case, we need to realize what the affirmative advocacy is. We're saying that in a certain instance, UN peacekeepers should have the ability to use offensive operations. If you negate, you're saying that they can never do that. So if you think that there's just one instance in which we need offensive operations, you should affirm. Now with that in mind, let's look to my opponent's case. In their first contention, they say that we shouldn't use offensive force because when we take a side, that harms our path to peace. There are a couple problems with this. First, it's non-unique. This happens with defensive peacekeeping operations as well. Take, for example, our current operations in Mali. UN peacekeepers there aren't using offensive operations, they're using defensive operations, but they're clearly on the side of the Malayan government and against the rebels in the region. They are taking a side and they're using defensive operations. Second, we actually need offensive operations to uphold impartiality and uphold legal norms. According to Hikara Yamashita of the National Institute for Defense Studies, impartiality has come to mean a robust mandate implementation. The reason for this is that we actually have to use offensive force to people who are committing human rights abuses. If we sit by and let human rights abusers get away with what they're doing, that shows that we aren't being impartial and it actually harms peace efforts. Looking at my opponent's specific points, they talk about civilian protection and how there's going to be this backlash against civilians. The problem with this is that doing nothing is going to incite even more backlash. The Wall Street Journal reported in 2012 that civilians are tired of sitting by while UN peacekeepers do nothing. In the Congo, this resulted in civilians attacking UN peacekeeping bases. Indeed, in one attack, they attacked a UN base and killed 11 peacekeepers. If we sit by and do nothing, that's not the solution. In my opponent's second contention, they talk about these harms that are going to make offensive peacekeeping fail. First, they talk about a lack of funds. However, they fundamentally misunderstand how funding UN peacekeeping operations work. They're funded on a mission-by-mission basis on how much people want to donate. With offensive operations, there's more support to donate more money. Specifically, according to Donald Stowe of the Strategic Studies Institute, there's more support for offensive missions from the big funders, specifically the United States and European powers. Then they talk about a lack of troops. Fortunately, China's solving this problem. In recent years, China's tripled the amount of peacekeeping troops that they're putting in, and they can solve for any gaps. Third, my opponents talk about a lack of info. We can use this, like we talked about in our second contention, with intelligence gathering drones that can get the necessary information for offensive operations. Then they talk about a lack of command. However, the United States actually contributes military generals to these peacekeeping operations, so they have good leadership and good command. Then looking at my opponent's impacts, they first talk about how the UN is seen as an intervention force, or an occupation force, and that's no good. First, remember that the people want the UN to use offensive operations. They've been striking the UN when the UN hasn't used offensive operations. They talk about how tens of thousands of people are going to be displaced with fighting the FDLR, but look at what was happening before the UN actually intervened with offensive force in the Congo. Specifically, according to Alexia Jablonski, writing in the McGill International Review, over 1 million people were displaced in the Congo conflict before the UN intervened with offensive operations. Then my opponents go on to talking about how we're changing the conflict, and instead of militants fighting militants, they're now fighting civilians and these UN non-offensive operations. The problem with this is that this empirically hasn't happened. Specifically, according to Abby Stoddard of NYU, there's no strong evidence of a correlation of increased attacks on aid workers or UN peacekeepers in areas where the UN plays a more aggressive role in the conflict. Even if we have offensive operations, this hasn't happened in the status quo. The reason for this is that increased mission success means that these rebel groups are being taken out. Take, for example, in the Congo, we've seen a decrease in violence. Now, quickly returning to the affirmative case, specifically about the Ukraine point. My opponents bring up in Crossfire that Russia's going to veto any proposal to do this. There are 3 problems with this. First, it's politically unfeasible. Russia said they don't have any interest in the Ukraine region, and they deny any troops in the region, so it would be politically infeasible for them to veto it. Second, it saves face for Putin. Currently, the rebels are losing in the Ukraine. However, Putin doesn't want to be seen as weak and doesn't want to lose. At that point, it gives him a cop-out for his propaganda machine. Third, what Eileen brings up about how the UN or Russia can't actually veto this. So for all of these reasons, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Will, judges. Before I get into the specifics of their cases, 2 overall problems with their reasoning. The first is, if you would believe them to be true, then we should have expected offensive force in the past to be successful. Yet according to Simon Chesterton of NYU, who's in case and they never respond to, every single time we've used offensive force in the past, it has failed. The significance of this is that even if you buy their theory, the fact that in reality is a failure is going to be enough for you to negate. The second overall problem is that they're making the wrong comparative in their case. They're comparing traditional peacekeeping with offensive peacekeeping, but that's not the comparison that's going to happen in the real world. Post-2003, the Brahimi Report authorized the United Nations to use things called robust peacekeeping, which means using any force necessary to protect civilians, which is an offensive force. In fact, Coffee and Sia Pepper, their own author, tells us that that reduces civilian killings by 31% compared to offensive force, which increases civilian killings by 1,600. When you make the right comparison like they're not making, that's where you see the harms of offensive force. Now to their first contention, which talks about protecting civilians. There's a lot of problems with this.